an esoteric.
You'll say no
Cool.
more.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, so basically, just kind of give you a bit of a heads up of this. I was watching a video piece the other day from Martin Picard. So I watch quite a lot of Martin stuff. So Martin's sort of in my opinion, sort of the mitochondrial guru out there at the moment and his involvements. But he made a comment. It was a general interview with him, and he made a comment towards the end of it that set my brain in a direction. He spoke about um, the idea or the concept of what if um, consciousness, the idea of consciousness was external um, to us. And raising the question, what is consciousness? And he kind of, I want without going into all the details of what he said, what if we live, if I in our environment is we live in a constant flow of energy or consciousness? He kind of said, he said, what if energy and consciousness were the same thing? And he kind of couched this idea by saying, if you're a fish that lives, sort of at the bottom of the sea all the time, you're probably unaware of water. You probably have no idea that you're living in the ocean. You're
Mm.
just living in your environment, and there's this flow of stuff around you which guides, has currents and things that directs you. And so, is it possible that we live in a flow of energy? And he said that energy might be what some of us would call God. He said if you were a Star Wars fan, you might want to call it the Force. Um, but what if we just live in this idea of energy? And it was an interesting little side point that he was making to the rest of his video, the rest of the interview that he was on. But it sent me down a rabbit hole of looking at what I've now, through this rabbit hole, discovered is something that philosophers talk about quite often. It's called the philosophy of mind, which is this idea of what is consciousness? What do we mean by consciousness, and where does it come from? And there's lots of sort of big names in this field, and I watched quite a few videos. I can't remember all the names. I can't remember everybody, but the idea was firstly that people that look at consciousness or the concept of consciousness, or people that investigate this philosophy of mind idea, have something that they call the big question. And the big question is, where does consciousness come from? What is it? It's the big question because it's a question that hasn't been answered. And the schools of thought, the proposals in there seem to are within there's three schools of thought. So the first school of thought is what they call the materialists. And the materialists are the scientists who believe that consciousness comes from biology. So within our brains, we've got all the biological stuff that we all completely understand. And within that biology, something is happening that then creates this ability of awareness and consciousness. The only problem is nobody knows what. So in years and
Mm.
years of neuroscience and neurosearching, nobody's been able to see it. They haven't been able to see something happening that says this is consciousness. So
Mm.
so we know how the brain works, but we don't know how it relates to consciousness. But the materialists believe that at some point we'll find it out. The second stream of thinking is the dualist. So this is the religious perspective where you have the biology of the brain, and then you have something which is external, call that the soul or whatever different religious belief you have, which that is something external, and that there is a communication between this external and the internal. So the soul, if you like, this external energy is talking to our biology, and that gives us a sense of consciousness. The scientists kind of say, well, if that was happening, we would be able to see it when we measure brain activity. If the biology is talking to an external something, then we would see synapses firing up when this communication was taking place. That's obviously a very typical, hard science way of trying to look at theology, but that's dualism. But then I came across this third way of thinking, which is really, really interesting to me, which is called panpsychism. And now I can't remember what it is. Every brain, whatever it is. So panpsychism kind of ties in a bit with what Martin Picard was talking about. So panpsychism kind of says that everything has consciousness. Everything, material things have consciousness, but at different levels. So not consciousness in the sense that we have consciousness, in that our consciousness is aware of its own consciousness, but on smaller scale. So panpsychism basically has two definitions. Firstly, for what consciousness is or what it creates. The first thing they say, and this is important because I'll circle back around to this in a bit. The first thing they say is that any system that needs to remain intact has to have a level of consciousness. So anything where you want to either control or slow down the concept of entropy. So entropy says that everything gets hot eventually, and as it gets hotter, it gets wider and wider apart, and until it becomes complete chaos. The very simple version of entropy. So anything that needs to stay in a controlled system needs to be able to combat entropy, and that requires consciousness. And then the definition, or one of the definitions given, and there's obviously loads of consciousness, is therefore consciousness is the ability to use experience to predict the future and then control a system to handle that prediction. So human consciousness works like that specifically, right? We know that what we really do with our consciousness is our brain is constantly using our life's experience to predict what it thinks is going to happen and primes us to respond accordingly. I mean, one of the reports, one of the videos I watched actually spoke about an experiment that's been done a few years ago where they actually took people and they obviously measured brain activity. I can't remember whether it was MRI or ECGs. I can't remember exactly what they use, or EEG, should I say. But basically, they asked people to make a series of questions, and they looked at the brain activity in response to that, to the choices that they made. And once they'd learned the brain patterns, they could actually ask somebody to choose, object A or object B. And they actually knew the choice the person was going to make before they made it, because their brain activity showed the making of the choice about 4 seconds before the person actually makes the choice. So your brain actually starts the process of choosing where it's going to go before you are aware that you've actually, I'm going to choose the apple over the pear, whatever it might be. So that's this idea of consciousness, that it is using our history or using our experience to predict the future, and then that knowledge is used to keep us alive or keep the system from breaking up. So this panpsychism then basically says that starting at a subatomic level, so at a quantum level, you have quantum particles have a level of consciousness, and then those particles make up atoms, and those atoms have a level of consciousness. And as these systems get bigger and bigger, the level of consciousness has to become greater and greater to keep it together. And of course, every level of consciousness then sits within a greater level of consciousness. And then you get to the human being, where all these things come together, or into a living thing, where that consciousness obviously is far more evolved. And in the case of humans, maybe animals, we're not sure, we get to the point where these little eddies in the flow of consciousness become self-aware. So our consciousness is aware of our consciousness. So that's panpsychism. And it seems like if you look at the history of it, many great scientists, I'm talking about Max Planck, what's his name, Albert Einstein, a lot of great scientists kind of talk about this concept that consciousness comes before matter rather than the other way around. But they all seem to talk about it right at the end of their careers, which is really interesting. So when they're no longer looking at looking for grants or being professors and all of these things, they start to talk about these things because it maybe sounds a little bit kooky, and they think talking about them too early might interfere with their integrity or their the way they're perceived while they're still practicing. I would love to know, and I don't know the answer, how many of these great scientists or great thinkers actually came to this idea or this concept very, very early on, but just kept it to themselves because they didn't want to come across as being kooky. And then only when they were in their latter years and, they got Nobel Prizes and they were in a really comfortable spot, did they start to express some of these ideas. But there's one person within this concept is worth we're looking at his videos, a guy called Rupert Sherwood. And he takes us to the next level. He also talks about mind-altering drugs, and it's quite clear from his demeanor that he's investigated this to quite some practical extent in his own right. But he turns around and he says, well, why should this level of consciousness then stop at the human being, right? We have bigger systems that need to hold themselves together. So the Earth is a system. Our solar system is a system. The sun is a system. And if those levels of consciousness within those are bigger than us because they've got to hold these big systems together, it kind of ties in with this idea that Martin Picard had, that we're living in this flow of energy, right? That we can't see, we're not aware of it because it's just so, we're just so entrenched and it's all around us. This Rupert Sherwood kind of then relates that to a lot of ancient religions. So obviously he talks about the sun god, the worship of Ra by the ancient Egyptians. He spent a lot of time in India, and he talks about the fact that Hindus today, in part of the Hindi practice, which I wasn't aware of, is you wake up in the morning before the sunrise, get some good red light as you go there, and you thank the sun for looking after us, for giving us light, for giving us energy, and you actually respond to that. Um, and he ties it all together, and he sort of says, as I say, these are all just ideas and philosophical concepts. Um, and he talks about the fact that sun flares and sunspots might be our sun communicating with other stars. And yes, it might take 100 million years to travel 100 light years to the next star, for the message to get there and then come back. But if your lifespan is the lifespan of the sun, then 100 million years to communicate is, potentially not a big deal for you, right? So I started looking at this and started thinking about this, and then bringing it back to Martin and bringing it back to my own research. And the first thing that I thought of is that, well, the mitochondria are a closed system. So according to this idea of consciousness, they need to have a level of consciousness to keep them together. And then I thought about what the purpose of consciousness is based on this thinking, which is that it uses historic events, so it uses experience to predict the future. And then I realized my whole PhD is about mitochondrial programming and reprogramming. So if you read my paper, we talk about programming a lot.
Yeah.
Well, programming could very well be, we say the mitochondria experience the lifestyle we give them, the sugar or the no sugar or the dieting, whatever it is. And then they control membrane potential and they control a whole bunch of things based on that. Well, is that not using experience to predict the future and then control the way the mitochondria behave based on that experience and the prediction of what you think is going to happen next? And if you're doing that, the main model that we talk about with my supervisor and Alex and I, is we talk about the supply and demand adjustment model, which is Alex's model for doing this, where we say the mitochondria have these levers. They have all these little controls, which, based on the programming, manage the flow of energy, the supply and demand of energy, such that you don't have 100% efficiency, because you've had 100% efficiencies. If all the electrons are all and all the oxygen coming into the mitochondria, and all the protons got pumped through synthase, complex 5, the synthase, to form ATP, well, you'd have a system that would burn itself out, number one. But number two, you'd have no reserve capacity because the system would be operating at max. And then when there's a sudden increase in demand, it wouldn't be able to cope. But also, you've got to manage the supply side by having proton leak. You do that. But if you had too much proton leak, all your energy, instead of producing ATP, would be turned into heat and dissipate in terms of entropy, and the system would fall apart, which it does eventually when mitochondria misfunction. And obviously cytochrome C then escapes and we have apoptosis of the cells. So basically my philosophy around this was this idea that the supply and demand adjustment that I look at as a physical thing in mitochondria might be the output from the mitochondrial conscience.
Yeah, the
It's
expression of the consciousness.
it's using its history to predict the future, and then it's flexing these levers to maintain the balance of energy supply and demand across the system, such that it's in an optimal zone, or it thinks optimal zone. And we call that programming, but based on this whole idea, that programming might be consciousness. And then consciousness evolves. And it's just I've been spinning my head around this, and I'd really just love to know your take on that. Where do you think comes that? And again, that ties into what Martin would then call the force, the energy we live in, this idea that consciousness came before matter. Thoughts?
There's a lot there.
I spent a whole weekend on this. You just heard about it for the first time now.
Couple of things that come to mind. Um, if you look at the aspect of things like Reiki and spiritual healing, if that makes sense, that they don't touch you, but they work within energy. So that there definitely is something there. But I'm also going to disagree with you a little bit around when, the line that you said, these thought leaders or geniuses like Einstein, etc. Adam Smith wrote the book on the gift of nature 7 years before the wealth of nations. And his aspect is that sunlight, nature, and food are essential for human beings.
Yeah,
But it was
can't
poo-pooed.
disagree with that.
It was poo-pooed actually, and this was 250 years ago. The one bit where I didn't hear you talking about it is the impact of light is a different energy. That's, when you talk about quantum and you talk about energy, and when you mentioned there around, was it the Hindus wake up and worship the sun? That's
Yeah.
also very reflective of the Aboriginal culture in Australia. Is it similar in the sort of rawness of the African culture as well?
Mm.
The
Yeah.
rural ones would get up and like
For many.
the elders.
Yeah. So for me, and this isn't a theoretical discussion, right? But for me, potentially what you're saying of that supports the idea. I mean, if you think about how far apart the Aboriginals have evolved in distance in Australia to where the Hindis in India are, and yet they've come up with this similar concept, in their own right, would that not potentially indicate that this common flow of energy that we all live in? Because Rupert Sherwood talks about some people have a greater ability to tap into this flow. So maybe your
Mm.
Reiki practitioners, right, are tapping into that. Um, and that's where he says, when people start to sort of get, people telekinesis, and people start to be able to, get certain, maybe come across as having a more of a spiritual side. Maybe they just got the ability to tap into this flow to a greater extent. I mean, he talks about quite a bit that kids probably tap into this flow when you're born for a number of years, and basically most kind of lose it at some point. I mean, there's even the link. I mean, and be interested to know what you think about this, Ricky. So we know that things like children with autism are hypersensitive, and they're obviously their pattern recognition, everything is all heightened.
Mm.
So I just thought, is there a possibility that kids with autism actually got a greater feel for this flow of energy, this force, if you want to call it, whatever we call it, this greater consciousness, and they're actually more in tune with that to some respect, and maybe our brains struggle with that because it's a little bit more than what we're wired to be able to perceive. And that might be some of the reasons for the sensory overload for autistic children. It's just a thought that I've had. But you get all these stories about kids that claim that they've suddenly remember past lives and these things. And it might be that they're not actually they haven't been reincarnated. They don't remember a past life, but maybe within the energy around them, they're tapping into some of these events this
Mm.
greater consciousness of energy, which remembers things. And Martin, you said there's different kinds of energy, and I think all of these guys, again, this Rupert Sherwood's quite strong in this, is that, and in fact, Martin Picard actually said this as well, that energy, gets transduced. So everything is energy. Sound is a vibration, is energy. Light is very definitely energy. Heat is energy. Um, I remember reading this. There's a book behind me somewhere, written by Mickey Hart, one of the two drummers for the Grateful Dead. It's a book called Drumming on the Edge of Magic, which talks about the fact that 1% of the world's population are percussionists, but that drumming or rhythm has always had a more religious ability and energy, and the fact that most religions, particularly ancient religions, use drumming to bring out the spirit world and to put shamans into trances and all of these things. But he's certainly, being a member of the Grateful Dead, has tapped into his other levels of consciousness consciousness through the use of psychedelic stimulants. But he makes a point in this book, which is one of those great acid trip sounding comments. But I'm reading the comment, or I'm remembering the comment in a new light as part of this. He turns around and says, "Sound is a vibration. All matter vibrates. Therefore, a stone is frozen music." Yep, those molecules are vibrating, which I thought was an interesting comment, if a little bit out there. But I always struggle with this idea of sort of spiritual thoughts and trying to be a rational scientist and things. But this idea of energy and flow and living in this panpsychism, it's a great term as well. It's just kind of, for me, it's maybe giving me for the first time a way of linking my empirical evidence-based way of thinking with maybe this idea that that there's this that,
Something more.
there's an explanation for this energy around us.
I've not gone that deep. I stopped at the sort of, I use a computer analogy whereby we've got biology is the physical hardware, and then we've got consciousness, which is our software, but the two need to be compatible. If you're trying to run your software on hardware that's compromised, your software is not going to function properly. But I've not gone deeper than that.
Well, just thinking on those lines, I mean, let's extend it a little bit, right? So the question becomes first within this, what comes first, right? The hardware or the software? What came first? The matter, the material, or the consciousness? Now, traditional thinking would say, right, well, we developed, I don't know, Ida Sinclair spectrum and all of that. But really, in the evolution of PCs today, do you not think that Microsoft Windows was the starting point, the consciousness of the computer revolution? It's then hardware and processing power has had to increase in order to really be able to handle what the software is capable of doing, which has evolved from being a handheld calculator going 1 + 1 = 2 to being AI. And of course, all of this then comes into the greater question, and I'll put this out there as a thought process. At what point does AI develop its own level of energy, and is that the point where it becomes sentient?
Maybe. Yeah. We're probably not. I think last I saw was about 10 years off of that.
I don't think we're anywhere close, but I guess the point is, when AI has its own ability to use its own experience to make its own predictions of the future, and then based on those predictions decides on its output. At that point, has it developed conscious? It might not be conscious of its own consciousness. It might be conscious in terms of panpsychism, saying a cell is conscious or a table is conscious. So it might not be aware of its own consciousness. Martin Picard, in his little scenario, said that this energy is flowing in a constant stream, but every now and then it gets disturbed and it forms a little eddy. And that eddy becomes a small point where the consciousness is conscious of its own consciousness, i.e., one of us. So what happens when AI hits one of those little eddies?
What about two things come to mind? The power of the breath. Does that put you into consciousness or unconsciousness?
You see, here's a question that I've been dealing with, well, in terms of thinking about this, is we're conscious beings. We're aware of that, but we have both a conscious and an unconscious state, right? So when we're asleep, are we still conscious? Because we're not aware of ourselves when we're asleep, but we are dreaming. So I don't know the answer to that question. I think that's a question. Is being conscious, or is being conscious of our consciousness only a thing when we're awake and perceiving it? So or is our consciousness keeping us breathing even when we're asleep and we're by common definition unconscious? But we still have always our sleep consciousness, the equivalent of the consciousness of ourselves, rather than being a self-aware These are big questions. This is why it's called the hard question.
Here's some, taking it back to technology with things like the Aura rings and devices. When you're in a deep sleep or in a deep meditative state, are you conscious or unconscious?
Great question. I don't know the answer. I don't think anybody knows the answer. I think it depends on your definition of consciousness.
Yeah,
if your
definitely.
heart rate, if you get your resting heart rate down to the 30s, does that trigger, like in sleep, you have those 4 layers of REM? Does that have a different impact in the matter of your human body, if that makes sense? We're just looking at it through one lens, going, oh, you've got a heart rate of, I don't know, say 38. So you're not dead, but you're breathing in a very calm and measured way. But are you conscious of it, or are you training your body to be like that?
So let's work on this idea. If we stick with this definition, that the definition of consciousness is you use your experience to predict the future and then respond. If you are somebody that's trained yourself to lower your heart rate and be able to deep breathe and do the whole yogi thing and all of that, initially you have to be conscious of doing that because you're doing it to do it. But eventually you get the experience of knowing, okay, I'm going to a meditation state now. I'm going to slow my breathing down. I'm going to do all of this. And you become unconscious, or you do it unconsciously, or we would term unconsciously, but it's still it's still a level of consciousness because you're still using your experience to predict the future to control your behavior.
But is that sort of tapping into the Carl Jung aspect that you're not conscious until around the age of 6 or 7 because you don't have the experiences to tap your brain into?
I could buy into that, but I'm still saying that every cell in your body has its own level of consciousness already. It's obviously there from the time it becomes a working system. And that as your bigger consciousness has to be there from the start, but it develops as you build experience. With every bit of experience, it's got to get greater, right?
I'm going to take it a little bit further. Is this when we're born, or are we in vitro at that time?
Now, if I was going to be able to answer that question, I'd be setting the world alight, right? Quite literally, so I don't, but that's the question, right? But that's the question.
Where does the consciousness come into play? Is it 3 months during the pregnancy? Is it I was going to say it can't be pre-pregnant.
Yeah, well, it is pre-pregnant because we're saying that the cells have a level of consciousness. It's just when does the complete organism develop its own consciousness rather than the individual consciousness of each molecule, atom, cell, tissue, organ? How does all that level? At what point do you get to the greater consciousness of that? And then do we buy into the fact that the Earth as a planet, Gaia, right? If you follow the religions, when it does what is the flow of energy around us? Because the Earth is a controlled system. So in our cells and our things and in our bodies, we have our casing. As a human being, we cased in our layer of skin, right?
Yeah.
But every one of our cells is cased in a membrane. But the Earth is cased in an atmosphere. So it's a controlled system within that. This Rupert Sheldrake makes the point that the sun gives off magnetic and heat energy, and deep space beyond our solar system has its own magnetic energy. But where the sun's magnetic fields and deep space magnetic fields meet, there is a layer that basically surrounds our solar system, where these things are, where the two magnetic fields create a ring. Now he takes us to a point which I think, might be a step too far. I don't know. I suppose we're hypothesizing, but he makes this point that since life evolved on Earth, meteor strikes on Earth have dropped considerably relative to the amount of space rock that's out there in the greater space. So he's making the point is that does our sun's consciousness physically make I'm going to call it a decision, I don't know if that's the right word, to protect the Earth to protect us on it? Is the sun actually creating a field around us and an atmosphere that burns up space rocks such that planet Earth, relative to the amount of space rock out there, gets hit far fewer since life evolved than before, or than it really should be? Is our sun protecting us? That sort of thing kind of really troubles my mind, because that just sounds like bollocks to me. Or instinctively that sounds like bollocks to me. But within this idea, I mean, it's a thought worth thinking, right?
I would get stuck on what determines, or what is the determining factor in how, I wouldn't say how big, but how profound the consciousness. Because it's not just size. There's plenty creatures far bigger than us. So they have more cells. And by that definition that you're going on, if each atom and cell and and this compounding build-up of consciousness, then why are they not as conscious as we are?
Yeah,
So
and I'm sure if you look at some of the leaders in the field and talk with panpsychologists, panpsychosmists, I don't know what the word would be.
Psychos, yeah.
Versus materialists. I mean, they'll be having these kind of debates. So I definitely don't have any answers here, but I just love getting this feel of this whole idea of panpsychism, and this idea that consciousness is built, and then suddenly having a realization moment sort of somewhere on Sunday night that maybe within the way I'm looking at mitochondria in a lab, maybe that's what I'm looking at. I don't know that I'm looking at it.
It's an interesting
I'm looking at
expression, because maybe it is
reprogramming, and I'm looking at
consciousness.
I'm looking at reprogramming, and I'm looking at supply and demand adjustments by the mitochondria. But am I in a lab actually looking to examine mitochondrial consciousness? That's the realization that dawned on me just based on those
Potentially, yeah.
on that definition, that consciousness is experience, using experience to predict the future and then control or try to protect the system, whatever that system is. Using that, and that then becomes this whole idea of mitochondria talking to each other, which they know that they do. But we know they talk to each other chemically through chemical signals and through electrical signals. But who says they're not also? I mean, there's studies now about mitochondria responding to sound, right? That's sound waves. So as you said earlier, sound's just another form of energy. So maybe the mitochondria are talking to each other in all these ways, but also through other energy mechanisms, including ATP and heat, that we haven't really got yet.
I'm going to have weird dreams tonight, and it's your fault.
That's what I was kind of thinking. I'm going, right, you've had the whole weekend to think about this, and in the last half an hour you've downloaded it. I don't know where to go with this. It's like, if you told me at 9 o'clock this morning, then I would have worked on it during the day, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now I'm sort of going, what came first, the chicken or the egg? The consciousness of the matter.
Well, that's it. So let me start. I won't bring it up on the screen here, but I've actually had, interestingly, I've had this as a quote in my emails for a couple of weeks now, prior to me going down this route, but I didn't realize that maybe I was already tapping into this before I knew I was going to. But the quote from Max Planck that he again came towards the end of his life, he says, "I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as a derivative of consciousness." So he's firmly placing consciousness first, before matter. But there's a reason that I said, because we just for depending what we do with this, this is just part of a first Wednesday of the month discussion that we three have about all sorts of bits and pieces. But before we started this one, I said, please, let's record it. And the reason why is I'd love the two of you to think about this time. And if you want, share this with your, with your followers, maybe put your own top and tail before and after, with maybe some views that you might want to add after having thought about it and done, on your own afterwards. I'm starting, and then I'd love to see what other people think. I let other people listen and get,
Mm.
let's see who's tapping. But I love that form that you spoke about, Reiki and all of these things. As you say, Reiki is non-contact, right? So I've always thought that Reiki works through energy because you can focus heat into your hands, right? So you can focus your hands to warm up, um, which is, in my terms, mitochondrial terms, is basically just consciously, my conscious, forcing the mitochondria in my hand to uncouple greater. So basically, have more energy dissipating as heat rather than forming ATP, rather than coupling to the full oxphos. So the idea would be that somebody who performs Reiki might have much greater control to be able to do that in their hands to the point where it gives off heat energy, which can then transfer um, across. But now within this sort of way of thinking, it might be that they're actually tapping into this greater energy flow that surrounds us to be able to pass a positive vibration, heat, message. I don't know what we want to call it, from one to another. And maybe that's the basis of all healing. Maybe, maybe healing, because healing's a process, right? I mean, I did love something that I think Martin also said in that quote, or somebody else said, was that being healthy isn't like a spot. You can't say right now I'm healthy. It's not. Health is a condition, right? Health is a practice. It's a
Mm.
process that you follow, and it's a practice that you are continuously keeping yourself in a state of health,
So
right?
I am listening. I've just spotted that I got back earlier, put the shopping on the floor, and didn't put the milk in the fridge. So before that goes bad, let me put that in the fridge.
Have you ever so I did past lives as part of my healing many years ago.
Right.
Now, I've tried a few things, right? I've tried energy healing and past lives, etc. And I remember having a conversation with a mate. This was about 8, 10 years ago. I did past lives. And I thought this guy would have been quite open to receive the information around past lives and alternative, now that, if you want to call it alternative therapies, etc. But he went down a rabbit hole of his belief system and why he thought all of these were wrong. So
Right.
he had a very narrow-minded point of view that thought that anything outside that spiritual aspect around, he's very Christian, and anything that wasn't in the Bible was not an effective tool to have.
Right. And now, with a bit of hindsight, I think I'm probably equally, or I probably have been equally as closed-minded from the other aspect, from the exact reverse. If it isn't empirical and scientific, it can't be so.
Mm.
And these sort of realizations over time, and as I've looked into these bigger pictures, I'm kind of becoming. I'm scared to use the word spiritual because it's a redefinition of my whole character, but maybe more in tune with this idea that maybe there is a force, and I don't care what you want to call that force, but there is energy that
So I,
guides.
a couple of years ago, I presented at Strathclyde University here, and it was actually a pitch to do a PhD on the impact of spiritualism on health and well-being. The hardest part was defining what spiritualism is.
Mm.
Yep.
So is it quantum physics? Is it quantum movement? Is it energy? Is it, you know, spiritualism is one word, but it's so diverse.
Yep.
But unfortunately, I didn't get any funding, so it wasn't
Yeah.
to be.
Yeah. As I said, my purpose for this discussion was there's no answers. I certainly don't have the answers, but and it'd be amazing if I did, because as I say, these people that have been these philosophers of mind have been debating this idea of
Mm.
the big question, or the hard question, sorry, of consciousness for for hundreds for hundreds of years. So I'd love to have thought I could have solved the whole problem in one weekend, but
Yeah,
Uh,
all you've done is succeeded in making sure that I dream weird shit tonight, man. I can
I'm
see
not
it
going to be
already.
dreaming of either of you boys, but yeah, I'll probably be.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah, but I'd love to share
I
this
dream in
conversation and get other
Technicolor
people's
anyway.
thoughts.
Like, the only way I know that I'm dreaming is I wake up from it. But my dreams are indistinguishable from reality. It's like, but I can fly and I can do weird stuff. And yeah, now I'm gonna dream even weirder stuff tonight, man.
Maybe it's just that energy flow around you, just giving you some more insights into things,
Mm,
and maybe now it'll flood your brain tonight because it's going, oh, okay, Ricky's ready to start looking at us now.
maybe teach me how to
But yeah,
tap into
I
that
just
flow and make my business work. There we go.
yeah. Well, that's but I'd love to kind of share this recording and just get loads of input and maybe just start other people thinking. I like the idea of the more
It'll
people.
be polarizing, I can tell you that much. Like
Yeah.
you'll have some
Well, I
people
think
that
that.
get on board and like get proper deep into the rabbit hole, and everyone else will be like, "Ugh, not touching that."
Yeah, but I think it's already polarizing. As I said right at the start, you got these three schools
Mm.
of thought, right? The materialists, or the dualists, and now this panpsychism, and they all disagree completely. The bottom line is that none of them have been able to actually empirically provide an answer. So
Yeah,
they could all be
yeah,
right, they could all be wrong, and maybe there's a fourth way that nobody's thought about yet.
yeah. We
That's
don't
almost your TED.
know.
Mate, that's almost your TED talk
Mm.
because it has no answer, but it has an
It,
inquisitiveness to learn more.
if anything, it's a good hook. If you think about how do we like the question, how do we increase public appetite and interest into mitochondria? This is a brilliant hook.
Yeah,
You can put it forward from a consciousness perspective rather than just a reprogramming. Makes it a little bit less scientific, makes it a bit more relatable, and makes it far more interesting, I think, to the non-science inclined people.
yeah. Maybe I need to put a presentation together around exploring it further. As I said,
Mm.
there's big names in this field. I think Nagel is one of them, and sort of people. But I've only just sort of just scratched the surface, so I haven't really sort of delved down. And with the PhD, obviously, I'm not
You
sure
know
I'm going to
that
have the time to do that
if
all.
you
But
could throw something together and people like the Seed Talks or TED might pick it up.
Mm.
Nothing, just as something
yeah,
different.
yeah. Well, let's share this recording and see if anybody adds to it.
Hmm.
Yeah, as I said, I always get scared about going down rabbit holes because I need to focus on the PhD and spend more time on the rabbit holes. But this is just one that grabbed me because I suddenly found that maybe I've been studying consciousness without knowing maybe I
Yeah,
was
there we go.
unconsciously studying consciousness.
I like it. Yeah, I'll upload the recording onto my Google Drive and share it with you guys.
Thanks,
Yeah.
buddy.
All right.
Hey, talking
Well,
about
let's stop the recording now, and then we can just
have a chat.
carry on the chat.